Today we're going to be running through the top 10 schools of incantations. Since our top 10 sorcery builds, this has been our #1 most requested video. This is a similar format to our top 10 sorcery builds with the exception that is 100% based on incantations and no weapons will be included for any of these. This allowed us to see which incantation schools need the company of a weapon and which ones were able to perform entirely without.
All of these builds are tested on New Game Plus 8 at roughly level 330. These builds will be based off of the following categories out of a score of 40. Agile bosses, large bosses, average bosses, open world, PvP, defense, fun, ease, and aesthetic.
Since we are at such a high level, we were able to soft cap our faith, intel, and arcane, or faith, strength, intel, effectively allowing us to maximize the potency of all of these incantations. For many of these, we started to notice that the high scaling from the Golden Order seal outperformed the damage bonus of dual wielding the same seal for a lot of classes. We'll be addressing our 1,000 subscriber raffle at the end of this video. And without further ado, let's get into it.
So technically there's 12 schools of incantations. However, this is really a top 10 list because 2 of the schools are awful. Starting with the 2 fingers incantations, the 2 fingers scored 0 damage points in 15 seconds. Unless they're next to a cliff, then it's an instant KO. So for those reasons, the 2 fingers build gets a 5 out of 40. Although rejection is pretty fun sometimes.
Up next, we have the Blood Incantations. Fortunately, we're not really counting this one because it was so underwhelming and horrible that we didn't really want to rank it because it ranked so low. Ironically, when we did the DPS test though, we did it on this huge dragon, which the bleed procs are based off of a percentage health, which means it actually outperformed most of these builds on the list, with the highest damaging ability being the Blood Boon, netting around 40,000 damage in 15 seconds. However, when it came to the practicality of applying these things, you were never able to be put in a situation where you can spam these abilities and kill a boss that quickly. For most bosses, we ended up using Swarm of Flies or Blood Flame Talons, which although cool, they honestly weren't that great. Blood Flame Talons did the most amount of damage but had a lower bleed proc, so you could stack that with Swarm of Flies. But even then, we were beating our head against the wall trying to kill anything with this build in New Game Plus 8. The only points that we awarded this school of incantations was 1 out of 3 for large, since the proportionate amount of health from bleed loss, 3 out of 10 for average bosses, 1 out of 5 for open world, 1 for ease, and 1 for aesthetic, bringing it to an 8 out of 40. These spells are really useful when paired with a bleed weapon build, and honestly just not good enough on their own.
At number 10, we have the Servants of Rot incantations. This build is centered around this helmet and these seals, combined with these spells. These are the recommended talismans for this build. This build is unique from other builds because it focuses on damage over time abilities. For the DPS test, the Rot build did 22,000 damage, with the spells being the Scarlet Aeonia and then spamming Pest Threads. Ranking number 4. Against bosses, this performed okay. You were dependent on your Scarlet Rot as the poison ability was negligible damage, and then from there you would just spam your Pest Threads. You'll do okay against average bosses. The only thing is you're definitely going to be taking hits while trying to get your Scarlet Rot to tick. For these reasons, we're going to be giving it a 6 out of 10 for average bosses. This build really struggled against Agile bosses since the dependency of Scarlet Rot was very tricky. Oftentimes, Agile bosses would move out of the way constantly from your spells or just hit you right out of the moveset. For these reasons, we gave it a 0.5 out of 3 for Agile bosses. For large bosses, it performed much better, especially against dragons or bosses with larger health pools. It was a lot easier to get your Scarlet Rot to get going, and then from that point, it was just easy just taking them out with your Pest Threads. Basically, the easier it was to get your Scarlet Rot up, the easier it was to defeat the boss. For these reasons, we gave it a 2.5 out of 3 for large bosses. For open world, this performed terribly. Your AoE was going to be your Scarlet Aeonia, which although it wasn't really hard to get off in open world, you're definitely taking hits in the meantime, but it would clear an area pretty easily. On top of that, you relied on Pest Threads, which if they were really close to you, the threads end up going around them and most of the threads end up missing. For these reasons, we gave it a 1 out of 5 for open world. Pest Threads would have been nice if you had a little bit extra range, which is why we added a specific talisman for that. Poison Mist is unique because you can use it while stealthed and they can even become poisoned without them even detecting you. PvP, this performed very poorly. Pest Threads is pretty cool when you have some distance, but overall it doesn't hit as much as most other spells in PvP scenarios. On top of that, Scarlet Aeonia, although it looks really cool, is really easy to see coming. If they are ranged, they can just pick you off while you're casting that spell. And then obviously Poison Mist doesn't do anything. For these reasons, we gave it a 2 out of 5 for PvP. For defense, this build definitely struggled. There wasn't really any defensive spells or abilities baked into these incantations, and you did require a specific helm, which of all the required helms in all of these lists, it was probably the strongest, but it is still weaker than your average helm that you would choose deliberately. For those reasons, we gave it a 0.5 out of 5 for defense. Despite a lot of these downsides, I really enjoyed playing this build. It was really satisfying once you had your Scarlet Rod up, and then you could just slowly pick off your enemies with pest threads. This build was not too easy to obtain, simply because one of your main damaging abilities required you to kill Melania, but because of the few spells that you do get, it is pretty easy to get the hang of the build. Personally, I found the aesthetic very cool. I do like the whole fungal infection kind of thing. Scarlet Rod is very unique to this game, and the Scarlet Aeonia spell is one of the coolest in my opinion. For these reasons, we're going to be giving it a 1.5 out of 3 for fun, a 0.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 1.5 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the total to a 16 out of 40 for the Servants of Rot Incantations.
At number 9, we have the Beastial Incantations. This build is centered around the Clawmark Seal and Beastial Incantations. The spells we primarily use for this build are these, but these spells would pair well. These are the standard recommended talismans for this build. This build is unique from others on this list because it primarily deals physical damage. The Beastial build on the DPS test did awful, scored dead last with 8,846 in 15 seconds, using the Beast Claw incantation. Against overall bosses, this actually performed pretty underwhelming. The main reason is that you don't have a big heavy hitting ability to really finish off bosses. You're left with low damage attacks that are used in high succession, which isn't good for bosses. For those reasons, we gave it a 1 out of 3 for Agile Bosses, a 0.5 out of 3 for large bosses, and a 3 out of 10 for average bosses. This performed best against average bosses because you were able to exploit physical weaknesses for bosses, like hitting dragons in the face with this rock, for example. For open world, this build performs pretty average. You do have some AoE abilities, and your fast attacks really shine in the open world. For these reasons, we're going to give it a 3 out of 5 for open world. For PvP, this would definitely be my build of choice among this list. You're able to apply a lot of pressure against your opponent with the Beastial Sling, and then once they back off to heal, you can just hit them right in the face with this Stone of Godrick. The only thing that would make this better is if you referred to our Strength Faith video where he also had a weapon. We gave it a 5 out of 5 for PvP. For defense, this build did pretty good. You have a healing spell. You also have a cleansing ability, which can be helpful in very niche situations. And this is probably the most agile build on this list. So for those reasons, we're going to give it a 3 out of 5 for defense. While I did enjoy this build in some aspects, being agile and quick hitting moves, overall, it still was missing that heavy hitting ability, which really makes a build fun for me. The weapons that this build would normally come with would definitely fill that void. The incantations are pretty straightforward with use, so they're quick to get the hang of. However, you do pretty much have to get to the end of the game in order to get all of the items and spells. I think the concept of this build and spells is really cool. However, the overall aesthetic was a little underwhelming. There wasn't a matching armor set to go with these incantations, and at the end of the day, you're just kind of throwing rocks. But all that said, you do have a pretty solid selection of spells, unlike the Servants of Rot. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 1.5 out of 3 for fun, a 1.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 2 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the total for the Beastial build to a 20.5 out of 40.
At number 8, we have the Fire Giant Incantations. This build is centered around the Giant Seal and these incantations. These are the recommended talismans for this build. This build is unique because it deals explosive fire damage that typically breaks poise. Coming in at number 10 for the DPS test, we had the Fire Giant, which did 8,958
damage in 15 seconds, using the Giant's Flame Take Thee. Against bosses, this performed pretty average. You're mostly banking off of the Giant's Flame Take Thee spell, which is a really heavy hitting ability, and for a lot of average bosses, this would completely knock them on their ass. Against Agile bosses, this was a little tricky. Your abilities were really easy for most enemies to dodge, but you did have the saving grace that they had a lot of splash damage. For large bosses, you had the advantage of them mostly staying in one spot, although unfortunately, you didn't have a huge heavy hitting ability to our surprise. Even the Catch Flame ability was able to outperform the DPS. For these reasons, we're going to be giving the Fire Giant build a 1 out of 3 for Agile bosses, a 1.5 out of 3 for large bosses, and a 7 out of 10 for average bosses. For open world, although these spells fell a little short against bosses, most of these spells would be able to one-shot every enemy even if they weren't fully charged. On top of that, you had a good selection of AoE abilities, and for those reasons, we're giving it a 5 out of 5 for open world. For PvP, this was a little underwhelming. Your abilities would basically two-shot your enemies, but they were really easy to see coming. They were also very slow and clunky, and for these reasons, we're giving it a 2 out of 5 for PvP. The defense of this build was pretty lacking. You didn't have any abilities that helped with defense or damage mitigation, with the saving grace being the Burn O Flame and the fact that you can just knock enemies down with most of your spells. But if you couldn't do that, you were left very vulnerable with the slow cast times. For these reasons, we're giving it a 1 out of 5 for defense. This build was kind of enjoyable because you just had these huge explosive abilities, which were extremely good in early game situations, but as you played through New Game 8 like we did, they became a little bit more lackluster. This build was easy to use once you got the spells, very straightforward, very powerful, but unfortunately they were pretty challenging to obtain, requiring you to get to a pretty late game area to get all of the spells. As far as the aesthetic goes, the explosive fire is definitely cool. Who doesn't love that? For these reasons, we're giving it a 2 out of 3 for fun, a 0.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 2 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the Fire Giant Incantations to a 22 out of 40.
At number 7, we have the Frenzied Flame Incantations, which are insane. This build is centered around the Frenzied Flame seal and these incantations. These are the standard recommended talismans for this build. This build is unique from other builds on this list because it deals madness damage to your enemies and yourself. The Frenzied Flame Incantations scored number 6 on the DPS test with 18,640 damage dealt in 15 seconds, using the Unendurable Frenzy. Against overall bosses, this actually performed pretty good. It did reasonably well against most average bosses in the game, especially Erdtrees. If the boss has a large hitbox, you can tick away at it very quickly with the Unendurable Frenzy, and if you start off at a distance, you can pick apart their health with the Frenzied Burst. For Agile bosses, this really fell short. You didn't have any quick casting abilities. Additionally, most of these spells were very slow to cast and easy to dodge. Also, you will end up proccing Madness on yourself at some point, locking you into a Madness pose, ensuring you will take damage or die. But for large bosses, this is awesome. Unendurable Frenzy will usually take them out very quickly, even in New Game +8. And for those reasons, we're going to give it a 0.5 out of 3 for Agile bosses, a 2.5 out of 3 for large bosses, and a 9 out of 10 for average bosses. For open world, this performs above average. You don't have any close ranged abilities, which can be challenging. However, you can clear most open world scenarios without enemies even detecting you with your Frenzied Burst. Other than that, we stuck to the Flame of Frenzy for most open world situations, and for those reasons, we're going to give it a 3.5 out of 5 for open world. For PvP, this performs slightly below average. You do have the Inescapable Frenzy, which although was buffed in the recent update, still doesn't really perform where it needs to. Frenzied Burst and Flame of Frenzy are usually the go-tos in PvP, but once you get Madness on yourself, it's pretty much a guarantee that you're gonna die. For defense, this build sucks. There's no healing capabilities. The only buff you have on this build actually reduces your defense, and you're locked into a helmet, which is just a cloth rag that literally is meant to cause as much pain to you as possible. You're also taking extra damage because you are causing Madness on yourself, and you lock yourself yourself into a madness pose, which leaves you susceptible to even more damage. So for those reasons, we're going to give it a 0.5 out of 5 for defense. You know what? Now that I think of it, there's really no redeeming quality for defense. So instead of a 0.5, we're just going to give it a 0. This build is pretty enjoyable to play. I do enjoy the madness spells, and it's a very unique theme. Most of these spells are looted. However, you do have to get them medium to late game, and the Flame of Frenzy seal is kind of annoying to get. You have to follow through this quest, which is also a very disturbing quest. The aesthetic of the madness spells is cool, and I like the lore behind the Frenzied Flame. I think it adds a lot to this game. And for those reasons, we're going to give it a 1.5 out of 3 for fun, a 1 out of 3 for ease, and a 2 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the total to a 22 out of 40.
At number 6, we have the Godskin Apostle Incantations. This build is centered around the Godslayer seal and these incantations. Additionally, the Godskin Noble Robe will buff the Noble Presence spell by an additional 20%. These are the recommended talismans for this build. This build is unique because it deals Black Flame damage, which is fire damage that also does damage over time. This damage over time is scaled off of the max health of the target, making it specifically useful against enemies with a high health pool. Because of this, the abilities do well even as the game gets harder and harder, since the health pools consistently increase through New Game Plus. The Godskin build came in number 5 in the DPS test, doing 21,000 damage in 15 seconds using the Noble Presence spell. This build performed well against most bosses. Your damage was always consistently powerful, but nothing incredibly insane like some of these other builds on the list. For Agile Bosses, this performed pretty well, considering you had some quick abilities, and you didn't have to fully charge a lot of these abilities to get most of the effect. Against large bosses, this performed slightly better, since they typically had a higher health pool, making your damage over time do proportionally more damage. For those reasons, we're going to be giving the Godskin spells a 1 out of 3 for Agile, a 2 out of 3 for large, and a 7 out of 10 for average bosses. For open world, this performed okay. You did have a lot of these abilities that didn't really matter on their percentage of health, since they all kind of suck. So everything was kind of one-shotting things, but overall, it was underwhelming compared to some other builds. The only downside I would say is that I wish the AoE abilities were further ranged. For those reasons, we're giving it a 2 out of 5 for open world. For PvP, this build performed above average. You can cast these spells pretty quickly, and they do a little bit of splash damage as well. On top of that, the Noble Presence is a really good defensive spell when they get too close, which usually devastates the battle. For those reasons, we're going to be giving it a 3 out of 5 for PvP. For defense, this build did okay. You had some nice close range defensive abilities like Noble Presence. You did have to wear these robes in order to buff that spell. However, you did have Black Flame protection to balance that damage mitigation. For those reasons, we're going to be giving it a 3 out of 5 for defense. This build overall, we didn't have the most fun playing. It just felt a little generic. It was cool to have the damage over time ability, but overall, we didn't really like the armor. It didn't look cool in our opinion. In my opinion, it does look a lot cooler on the actual Godskin Apostles than it does when you wear them. Most of these spells and the seal can actually be obtained pretty early in the game, and the rest you can obtain just by killing some Godskin Apostles. For those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 1 out of 3 for fun, a 2 out of 3 for ease, and a 1.5 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the total to a 22.5 out of 40.
At number 5, we have the Dragon Communion Incantations. This build is centered around the Dragon Communion seal and these incantations. This build is inspired by the Iron Dragon build by Chase the Bra. Link in the bio. These are the incantations we primarily used for this build. These are the downgraded early game versions of the spells. These are the standard recommended talismans for this build. This build is unique from other builds on this list because it has access to almost every element in the game for damage. You have fire, frost, magic, scarlet rot, and physical damage. For this build specifically, we are naked. We did no armor so that we could use the blue dancer talisman to increase our damage. For the DPS test, the Dragon Communion Incantations scored 25,021 damage in 15 seconds. Bear in mind, that is taken into account the frost proc dealt with Borealis Mist. The Glintstone Breath came in second with roughly 17,000 damage dealt in 15 seconds, but we can also buff it with Terra Magica. We didn't do it for this build, but just for experimenting, it scored about 22,000 damage in 15 seconds. Against bosses, overall, this build performs above average. Pretty solid. The diverse affinity types allow you to take on almost every single boss with ease. However, it does struggle a little bit against agile bosses. Pretty much every boss in the game you have an answer for. The Frost tends to do the highest amount of damage, so use that one. For large bosses, again, this performs above average. Because you tend to have a larger arena with large bosses, that extra range that you get from using the breaths comes in a lot of handy. All right, that sounded weird, but the point is that it's useful. For those reasons, we're gonna give it a 0.5 out of 3 for agile bosses, a 2 out of 3 for large bosses, and a 7.5 out of 10 for average bosses. For open world, this performs slightly below average. Every single spell you use takes a lot of time to cast. It also drains your FP when you use it, and the only real close range ability you have is Grail's Roar. So for those reasons, we're gonna give it a 2.5 out of 5 for open world. For PvP, similar situation for the open world. If you have a reasonable amount of distance, you can get off some of the breath spells, but if you're fighting close range, you only have the Claw or Grail's Roar to use, which again, take a lot of time to cast. For those reasons, we're gonna give it a 2.5 out of 5 for PvP. For defense, you don't have any healing capabilities with this build, you don't have any defensive buffs, and on top of that, your only real defensive spell is Grail's Roar. One of the benefits for defense is that you can cast some of these spells while jumping in the air, which makes you a little bit more agile. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 1.5 out of 5 for defense. Overall, this build is very fun to use. I enjoy the dragon spells. I think they're really cool and they're very useful for their diversity of uses. You do have to kill pretty challenging bosses in order to get most of the more powerful dragon breaths, but the Dragon Communion seal is looted very easily in Limgrave. It's one of the first seals that you can get in the game, and the aesthetic is top notch. You are just summoning the spirits of dragons to breathe on people. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 2.5 out of 3 for fun, a 1 out of 3 for ease, and a 3 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the total to a 23 out of 40.
At number 4, we have the Golden Order Incantations, also known as the Fundamentalist build. This build is centered around the Golden Order seals and the Radiant Mask. These are the spells that we use for this build, but these are some alternative spells that you can use. These are the recommended talismans for this build. You can also pair the Erdtree shield with this build to have a spell reflect combo with your discs. However, we are only including the seals for these builds, so we are not going to be ranking it with that in mind. This build has a lot of unique spells in general, including the Litany of Proper Death, which deals 600% damage to undead enemies. The Golden Order spells came in number 8 for the DPS test, doing 16,844 damage in 15 seconds using the triple rings. For average bosses, this performed pretty well. You had your triple rings of light, which dealt an incredible amount of damage, especially when you can stack them, and you can also dodge after you've cast them and they can still deal damage on the return. Against specifically undead bosses, the Litany of Proper Death came in handy. However, it has a kind of slow cast time, which definitely means you're going to be taking some hits, but usually I would even be able to kill some of the tougher Deathrite birds in just a couple of these casts. The discs were kind of challenging to hit some agile bosses, although it would come in handy when it came to the return of those discs. Large bosses typically had a larger hitbox, which meant the 3 discs would usually make contact on the cast and the return for all 3. For these reasons, we're giving it a 1 out of 3 for agile, a 2 out of 3 for large, and a 7.5 out of 10 for average. For open world, this performed extremely well. You had the single disc, which had an incredible range that we were kind of surprised by, making it a kind of snipe that had, again, a damage and a return damage. On top of that, the triple rings would clear a lot of enemies, and if that didn't work, you also had the Radigan's Ring of Light, which would completely clear an area. For those reasons, we're giving it a 5 out of 5 for open world. For PvP, this did above average. The discs were really fun to use, and if you didn't hit them on the way in, they'd often get hit on the way out, especially when you toggle in between your spells that you can cast within succession. It was really hard for your opponent to keep up. For those reasons, we gave it a 3.5 out of 5 for PvP. The defense of this build is rather underwhelming. Because we didn't include the shield, which would have helped, we only have a couple of spells that help us. You have the Law of Causality, which is kind of like a bubble. It doesn't reduce your damage taken, but once you take a certain amount of hits, it does explode and knock enemies back. However, we found that you had to take an insane amount of damage late game in order for this to even be effective. Additionally, you don't have any heals. Even though the order healing sounds like a healing spell, it only alleviates Death Blight, which isn't very useful. And then you want to use this mask, which isn't the greatest for defense, and for those reasons, we're giving it a 1.5 out of 5 for defense. This build was extremely fun to play with. I only wish that there was more bosses that were susceptible to holy damage. But even that being said, the discs and all of the other spells were super cool to play with. The seals are lootable in open world. The incantations are all obtained through Corrin's questline, and it's not too hard to get a hang of these spells. One of the downsides to this build is it does require both intel and faith to be pretty high for these to be very useful. That being said, once they're both capped, the Golden Order seal typically has the highest scaling of all seals in the game. The aesthetic of this build I thought was top notch. I really like the crown, although I don't like the rest of the armor, so we just paired it with some other golden armor. For those reasons, we're giving it a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 1.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 3 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the Golden Order incantations to a 28 out of 40.
At number 3, we have the Fire Monk incantations, and these are awesome. This build is centered around the Fire Giant seal. These are the incantations we primarily use for this build, but these are excellent options as well. We just typically didn't use them as often. These are the standard recommended talismans for this build. This build is unique from others on this list because it is the most agile fire casting build on this list. For the DPS test, the Fire Monk build came in 9th place, scoring 9,919 damage points in 15 seconds, using Catch Flame. However, that would have been a little bit higher if we weren't stamina capped. For average bosses, this performs surprisingly very, very well. The Catch Flame is your absolute go-to for most situations. You are very quick to cast and it deals a powerful amount of damage. Catch Flame is actually so fast that you can cast it in between your dodges. Additionally, the Surge of Flame spell allows you to dodge out of it with no delay whatsoever. For Agile Bosses, again, this is a very powerful build. Because you're so agile and so quick to cast, it made quick work of most bosses, even if they were trying to dodge. Large Bosses is where this fell a little bit short. What this build is lacking is range, and because of that, for large bosses, you have to be up close and personal to cast, making it a little bit more challenging. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 3 out of 3 for Agile, a 1 out of 3 for Large, and a 8 out of 10 for Average Bosses. For Open World, this performs slightly above average. The limitations here are your lack of range, and your only AoE spell causes damage to you also. The Surge of Flame is very satisfying to use, as you can see by this Black Flame Assassin getting burned up against the wall. Any enemy with low poise is just falling victim to the spell. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 3.5 out of 5 for Open World. For PvP, this was fucking insane. If you manage to hit your enemy with 1 Catch Flame, it typically means you're going to land 3, which means they're going to die. You can also cast it while sprinting and jumping. Personally, this would be my go-to for PvP. I know I said that about the Beastial build, but I also like this one. So for those reasons, we're going to give it a 5 out of 5 for PvP. For defense, this performs slightly below average. You do have a couple defensive spells. You have Flame Protect Me, which is only useful for fire defense, and then you have Flame Cleanse Me, which is good for niche situations like Poison or Scarlet Rot. But your only AoE spell actually does harm you in the process of casting. On top of that, you are limited by range, so for those reasons, we're going to give it a 2.5 out of 5 for defense. This build is very easy to get into because you can start the game with Catch Flame. The other spells are really nice to have, but ultimately Catch Flame, it was our bread and our butter. The incantations are generally pretty easy to get. However, the Giant's Seal is a little challenging to get towards the end of the game. Ultimately, this build is as powerful as you are good at dodging. Does that make sense? If it came down just to the spells, the aesthetic would just be alright, but baked into the Fire Monk armor and the fact that you can set yourself on fire raises the aesthetic just a little bit in my opinion. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 2 out of 3 for fun, a 1.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 2 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the Fire Monk incantations to a 28.5 out of 40.
At number 2, we have the Erdtree Incantations. This build is centered around the Erdtree seal, or if you have your Intel and Faith maxed out, you switch to the Golden Order, since the Erdtree seal actually doesn't buff Erdtree incantations. Go figure. However, the Crucible incantations are in this category, so you do want to utilize the Crucible Axe or the Crucible Tree armor set. These are the incantations that we primarily used. but these are some alternatives as well. These are the recommended talismans for this build. This build is unique because of its massive toolkit. You have such an array of spells and abilities that you can all mix to customize. You actually can't even fit all of them all in your casting bar at once. The Erdtree Incantations came in number 7 in the DPS test, dealing 18,556 damage using the Black Blade spell. Against bosses, overall this performed extremely well. You had Black Blade, which did holy damage over time, and it sapped your health. You had Elden Stars, which was a ranged, powerful holy ability. And then you had the Crucible abilities that did a lot of poise break with physical damage and even fire damage as well. Against Agile, you didn't really have very many spells that were extremely quick. I would say the fastest of those would be your Crucible Horns, and the Black Blade was very useful in this situation as well, since it was kind of a jump attack that had a ranged ability. Against large bosses, we typically stuck to the Black Blade since it had a health sap and it did the most amount of damage. For these reasons, we're going to be giving the Erdtree a 1.5 out of 3 for Agile, a 2 out of 3 for large, and an 8 out of 10 for average bosses. For open world, you really have every situation covered. You have AoE, both close range and distant. You have a lot of sweeping attacks, poise breaks, and ranged. So for those reasons, we're giving it a 5 out of 5 for open world. There's also the unique combo that your healing spells actually act as offensive spells against undead. On top of them healing you, the same amount of heal would be damage to an undead enemy. For PvP, this performed extremely well because of your toolkit. Casting Elden Stars and then following up with spamming Black Blade was extremely deadly. On top of that, the aspect of Crucible spells were very useful, and you had a lot of buffs to back yourself up. Although most of these abilities were pretty powerful, they weren't extremely quick, making it a little bit easier to dodge, but the overwhelming pressure was extremely powerful. And for those reasons, we're giving it a 4.5 out of 5 for PvP. For defense, this is definitely a 5. Your toolkit has so many defensive abilities and heals and buffs that we couldn't not just give it a 5 out of 5 for defense. This build was pretty fun to play with because of your extensive toolkit. I think the Crucible spells are not only very cool, but very powerful, and they're very niche. However, a lot of these spells are pretty challenging to obtain. Since they are very powerful, you have to really go out of your way to get this full toolkit, and you have to defeat some of the hardest bosses of the game to get some of these spells. The aesthetic to this build is extremely cool. Even the required armor set that you have is some of the coolest looking and best in the game. For those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 2 out of 3 for fun, a 0.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 2.5 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the total to a 31 out of 40.
And at number 1, we have the Dragon Colt 45 2 Zigzags Incantations build. Maybe that's all we need. This build is centered around the Gravelstone Seal. These are the primary incantations we used for this build. And these you can also use. These are the standard recommended talismans for this build. We didn't include the Godfrey icon in this talisman list because, to our surprise, Ancient Dragon Lightning doesn't actually get buffed by that talisman, because although it is a charged ability, the charge only increases the amount of lightning bolts cast as opposed to increasing the damage from the spell, which means Godfrey icon will only actually buff Lightning Spear. This build is unique from the others on this list because it exclusively deals lightning damage and destroys everything very quickly. Another cool thing about the lightning incantations is that if the enemy is standing in water, the lightning will actually cause a little bit of extra damage, and that little bit is about 10%. For the DPS test, the Dragon Colt Incantation came in first place with 56,113 damage dealt in 15 seconds, using Ancient Dragon Lightning. And one interesting thing we noticed was each successive attack caused more damage than the previous, by about 3,000 damage. We don't know why, it just did. We did this test also in our lightning build video, fully buffed, as maxed out as we could, and it scored over 150,000 damage points in 15 seconds. Against bosses, this literally just did ridiculously well for every single situation. You can kill pretty much every single boss with just a couple of casts, and most bosses are weak to lightning. So there's almost no drawbacks for this build whatsoever when it comes to any type of boss at all. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 3 out of 3 for agile bosses, a 3 out of 3 for large bosses, and a 10 out of 10 for average bosses. Honestly, when the game gets hard and we need to pass a boss really quickly, we just use this spec. Also, we have a video covering this exact build on our channel. link in the bio. For open world, believe it or not, this performs exceptionally well in almost every single situation. You have a wide range of AoE abilities that universally just kill everything around you very quickly. You also have Honed Bolt, which destroys people very quickly, and you have the Lightning Spear, which destroys people a little slower, but still really good, and from a distance. And then you have Force Axe Lightning, which is also just kind of ridiculous in its own right, and you have Ice Lightning. So for those reasons, we're going to give it a 5 out of 5 for open world. For PvP, this also is a very good, strong choice to use in most situations. Only drawback that we noticed is if you're against somebody who's applying constant melee pressure, it can be a little bit challenging because these attacks are best used at a range. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 4 out of 5 for PvP. One of the best abilities for PvP for this build is spamming Honed Bolt. For defense, this build doesn't have any healing capabilities. However, you're so ridiculously overpowered with almost every attack, basically no one can touch you. Shocking, I know. Although you have no healing incantations, you do have the Dragon Bolt Blessing, which makes you hard as a rock that repels slash and pierce damage, just like the turtles. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 4 out of 5 for defense. But in most situations, you really don't even need defense. How could you not have fun with this build? Both aesthetically and the fact that you can just run through the game like a friggin' god. You have 12 spells that are each super powerful in their own right. You can essentially be successful with any of them that you choose. Honed Bolt and the Lightning Spear are easy to get very early in the game. However, the most powerful spell, which is Ancient Dragon Lightning, although it's lootable, you do have to get all the way to the end of the game to get it. All of the other spells are pretty challenging to get, but you don't really need them, to be honest. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 2.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 3 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the Dragon Cult build to a 37.5 out of 40 and number 1 on the list. Okay, I need to cover the raffle. We tried to contact the initial winner and they didn't respond. We found a second winner, but they don't have an email. So the winner of our first 1,000 subscribers is this guy, Donald Topping. Donald, here's what we're gonna do. If you can send us an email at quietkingscontact@gmail.com within 48 hours of this video being posted, you will be the winner, and we will send you your prize via email. But you need to email us because we can't contact you. And if Donald doesn't respond in 48 hours, the next winner will be the funniest comment on this video within 7 days of posting. We really just want to give our thanks to you guys for supporting us. So this is the best way we know how at this time. And as always, thanks for watching.